Всем привет, люди! Это Cossackhetman. Hey there, everyone. This is Cossackhetman, and today we're going to be covering the Berestechko Bitva, or the Battle of Berestechko. This is one of the Zaporozhian Cossacks' greatest defeats during the civil war with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But it is a very important one that is remembered and cherished by both Ukrainian and Polish peoples, and of course Cossacks. And this is because it showed their character in defeat, and it set the path for improvement, making way for more fierce Cossack fighters such as Ivan Bohun and Ivan Sirko to change how the Cossacks approached Polish armies in the field of battle. For the Poles, this was a critical victory, as they needed to cripple the winning streak that Khmelnytsky was on. If the Poles did not, who knows how history could have played out. And I happened to have the personally very surreal experience of visiting the site of the battle and the monastery that is currently built upon this ancient site during my second trip to Ukraine. I had the honor of having the very good company of my friends Petro, Juliana, and Angelka, and we made a day of it. It is quite a bit of a drive from Lvov or Lutsk, because it is quite literally in the middle of nowhere, Western Ukraine. But once you take the drive and you go through the small village of modern-day Berestechko, you will come across this solemn and eerily beautiful sight, as it sits atop the marsh, surrounded by a plethora of weeping willow trees and rolling farmlands. Okay, so we're going to be going through some of the photos and a video tour of the site that I captured when I was there. And these are going to be intermingled between me blabbering about the history of the battle. So without further ado, let's jump in there and start with a nice video tour of the site itself. That way you can actually picture in your mind where this event is taking place and the sights and sounds that you could imagine. Hello, Ludzie. We're here at Berestechko in Ukraine. Here. A famous battle of the Cossacks against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Tartars. It is one of their well-known defeats after being on a string of victories where Khmelnytsky was betrayed by the Tartars.
Julka, Julia, photo please.
Underneath, in the catacombs. Alright, now that the tour is done and out of the way, let's dive right into the meat and bones of the Battle of Berestechko. I will have some imagery overlaid on me talking that is from the awesome film based on the even better book, Ognium i Veshchem, or in English, With Fire and Sword. And it actually shows some of this famous battle. I will give you first a quick overview, the spark notes, if you will, of the Battle of Berestechko, and then we're going to go down into a blow-by-blow battle report. Okay, so without further ado, from the Encyclopedia Britannica, the Battle of Berestechko took place from June 28th to 30th, 1961, and it was a military engagement done between the King of Poland, John Casimir II, who inflicted a severe defeat on the rebel Cossack leader Bogdan Khmelnytsky. So, alright, to understand why this battle happened in the first place, we need to go all the way back to 1648, when Bogdan organized an insurrection among the Zaporozhian Cossacks, who at the time were living along the Dnieper River in modern-day Ukraine. Now, I mentioned before in my previous video about the origins of the registered Cossacks and why the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth needed to implement the registration of Cossacks for legal and international political reasons. But by doing this, it caused a severe limitation to Cossack autonomy by reducing the amount of numbers that they could have, restraining them from conducting lucrative raids upon their Turkish and Crimean Tatar neighbors, and forcing them into a condition of serfdom under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth system. So, as a result, this is what caused the rebellion, among other things. But after a series of military victories, the Cossacks enacted the Treaty of Zboriev in 1649, making the Polish king John Casimir II sign a very unfavorable treaty. Now, although this settlement granted a large degree of autonomy to the registered Cossacks, thus forming a new privileged Polish class, it did fail to satisfy either the Poles or the unregistered Cossacks, and within 18 months of this treaty, hostilities were resumed once again. The Cossacks were formally taken under the protection of the Turkish Sultan in April of 1651 and were reinforced by the Sultan's vassal, the Khan of the Crimean Tartars. And thus we come down into the month of June, where the Cossack Tartar force advanced against the Poles to engage them in the Battle at Berestechko on the Styr River in the Volhynia region south of modern-day Lutsk. Now, the Cossack army was slightly larger than the Polish one, but in the midst of the fighting, the Tartar Khan and his forces left the field of battle. This action, which has been described by some historians as treacherous desertion, and by others as a strategic maneuver to establish another line of defense closer to the Dnieper in order to protect Kiev from an advancing Lithuanian army, enabled the numerically inferior Polish army to gain a strategic victory over the Cossacks. Subsequently, the defeated rebels accepted a new peace settlement, concluded at Bielitserka in September 28th of 1651. This reduced the number of registered Cossacks from 40,000 to 20,000, and it deprived them of the right to settle in and control various provinces that had been designated in the Treaty of Zboriev. Now, those regions mainly being western and central Ukraine. Now, neither the Cossacks nor the Polish Sejm, or parliament, accepted this new treaty, and in January of 1654, the Cossacks chose to recognize the divine claim of the Russian Tsar and to incorporate their community into the Muscovite state via the hotly debated Treaty of Pereyaslav. Now, you better freaking believe that I'm going to be doing a whole video on that treaty alone. Trust me, it's intense. So, now with that out of the way, let's go for the blow-by-blow on the 3 days of bloody battle that took place on the plain and swamps of Berestechko. Alright, so jumping into it. The battle took place on the hilly plain south of the Styr River. The Polish camp was on the river opposite Berestechko and faced southward towards the Cossack army, which was roughly about 2 kilometers away. The Cossack army's right flank was situated against the river Plyashivka or Plyashova, depending on your language, and their allied Tartar army was situated on their left flank. This is firmly considered to have been amongst the largest European land battles of the 17th century. Now, the exact number of Polish troops is uncertain, as we have a muddle of reports from both sides. However, one of the senior commanders, Duke Boguslaw Radziwiłł, wrote that the Polish army had roughly 80,000 soldiers, which included 40,000 regulars and 40,000 nobles of what they called the levy en masse, so levied men from surrounding lands, accompanied by roughly the same number of various servants, footmen, and the such. Some modern historians, such as Zbigniew Wojciech, Zoszew Zarowski, and Władysław Szapolinski, have reduced this figure to 60,000 or 63,000 soldiers. On the 19th of June, 1651, the Polish army was composed of 14,844 Polish cavalry, 2,250 German-style cavalry, 11,900 German-style infantry and dragoons, about 3,000 Hungarian-style infantry known as Haiduks, 1,500 Lithuanian volunteers, and about 960 Lipka Tartars. There were also around 16,000 German mercenaries who suffered from disease and hunger due to delayed pay and inflated food prices in the camp. A number of registered Cossacks remained loyal and participated in the battle on the Polish side. Many Polish magnates brought in their large private armies, not uncommon for the times. And in addition, there was a large militia force of limited value, numbering around 30,000 men, just completely stripped from their farmland and given something and thrown out onto the battlefield. Now, unfortunately, there's not a reliable source when it comes to the number of the Cossack and Crimean Tartar troops, but we can extrapolate their numbers based on the Cossack registered regiments that were confirmed to have been present and their census data from their yearly registration. The possible estimates thus range from around 80,000 men to around 120,000 men. The core of the Cossack army at Berestechko consisted of 12 regiments named after the towns, or stanitsas, that they were stationed in. The numbers provided below, or what I'm going to say, are according to the Treaty of Zboriev that happened a year prior. So, the Chehirin regiment, led by Colonel Mikhailo Krysa, was about 3,220 Cossacks. Cherkasy regiment, led by Colonel Yakov Vorochenko, about 3,000 Cossacks. The Korsun regiment, led by Colonel Ivan Gulyansky, about 3,470 Cossacks. Biletsverka regiment, by Colonel Mikhailo Gromka, about 3,000 Cossacks. Uman regiment, by Colonel Josip Hluk, was about 3,000 Cossacks as well. The Bratslav regiment, by Colonel Danilo Neche, 26,060 Cossacks. The Vinitsa regiment, by Colonel Ivan Bohun, 2,050 Cossacks, and the Peryaslav regiment by Fedor Loboda, about 2,986. Kropivna regiment, Colonel Filin Gizeliny, is around 1,993 Cossacks, and Mikhrod regiment, Colonel Matyev Hladky, 3,009 Cossacks. The Poltava regiment, Colonel Martin Pushkar, 2,970 Cossacks, and the Priolukye regiment, Colonel Timofey Nosach, 1996 Cossacks. So that's totaling 3,300 and oh my god, blah, blah, a lot of threes. All right, guys, let me try that one again. All right, a total of 33,313 registered Cossacks from the above lists. I had to compile that. No one else has actually done that yet. Now, we do know that the 5 other registered Cossack regiments of Kiev, Kaniv, Chernihiv, and Nizhny and Pavoloch did not participate in this battle, as they were currently being deployed mostly against that Lithuanian force that I mentioned earlier of Janusz Radziwiłł, and they were currently advancing on Kiev at the time, so they had more important fish to fry. So, this registered Cossack force was supported by a large number of Ukrainian peasants that were armed with scythes, flails, and knives, and were rather undisciplined and unorganized. Beyond that, the Crimean Tartar horde is estimated at some 28,000 to 33,000 men. There were also some allied mercenaries for the Cossacks as well, some 2,000 Don Cossacks from Russia, and a few thousand Turks and Vlachs. Alright guys, now that we've talked numbers to death that our head is spinning around and our heads are about to pop off, let's go ahead and talk strategy. Alright, for the Polish commanders, they were hoping to break the Cossack ranks with a powerful charge of their famous Polish winged hussars. Another great video topic, let me tell you. Now, this tactic had proven effective in many previous battles, including at Kherson and Kluzhin, and which would later prove successful at the 1683 Battle of Vienna against the Ottoman Turks for the fate of Europe. Now, the Cossack army was well acquainted with this Polish style of war, as they had much experience fighting against the Poles as well as alongside them during the course of the mid-1600s. Now, the preferred tactic for the Zaporozhian Cossacks was to avoid an open field battle. They preferred to fight from the cover of a huge fortified wagon camp that was bristling with cannons, muskets, and gunpowder. Lots and lots of gunpowder. Which brings me to a quick side note, folks. This is why I'm going to have to make like a million little videos covering all the different looks and equipment of the Cossacks through their 500-year history. As you know from that video in particular, the Cossacks have changed greatly throughout history. And that is not just limited to their culture, the persona, and, but it's even down to their gear, okay? So during this period of time in particular, for example, the Cossacks were actually renowned and feared more for their infantry, as their cavalry was in fact quite poor at this time. So, these Zaporozhian Cossacks were well-drilled musketmen that were armed with long-range rifles or devastating short-ranged black powder shotguns, small cannons, war hatchets, war picks, sabers, and armor-piercing knives, and crushing maces, and a mixture of armor, because this is due to whatever they could get their hands on or that they pilfered from people that they raided. So some of their officers had light plate mail as well as like actual chain mail, or most of them typically had just thick layers of cloth and leather clothing. Alright, and another important side note on top of this is that Eastern Europe in general at this period of time had access to gunpowder and firearms, generally speaking, earlier than Western Europe did. And this helps to explain for all of you how the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as well as other Eastern European powers, rose to such heights of power, wealth, and status so quickly during this time period, as they had a key battlefield advantage that was imported or raided from the Ottoman Turks. And that key being gunpowder. Boom! Right, so the first day of battle. Alright, from what is directly written, and I quote, 2,000 Polish cavalry, 1 regiment under the command of Aleksander Konieczny-Polski, supported by Jerzy Lubomirski, and 6 Pacerny cavalry companies of Jeremy Wisłowski, and winged hussars under the command of Stefan Szarzyński, repulsed the Tartars, who suffered heavy losses. During the day of skirmishes by the Tartars and Cossack vanguard regiments, the Poles were victorious, since their army sustained that first attack cheerfully and in high spirits. So, from the written accounts, it is evident that on the first day of battle, the Cossack-Tartar forces decided to actually assault the Polish force from their fortified position of the wagon camp. And ultimately, they were pushed back by a valiant countercharge of Polish, ultra-heavy cavalry, the famous winged hussars themselves. Now, this sight, is a sight to behold, and it bolstered the morale of the army so much so that they were able to hold the line long enough for the Cossacks to finally decide to disengage back to their camp before becoming completely enraptured by the victorious Polish cavalry that was coming in on their right and left flanks. So, that brings us then to the second day of the Battle of Berestechko. So, from what is directly written, and I quote, the Poles, encouraged by their success on the first day, deployed all of their available cavalry against the main Tartar horde and Cossack vanguard regiments. The Polish infantry and artillery remained in camp and did not support the cavalry. This time, Tartar cavalry gained the upper hand, pushing the Poles back to their camp, but were then barely repelled by heavy fire from the Polish infantry and artillery units. The Poles lost some 300 Zlachta, including many officers of caliber and the escort troop of Hetman Mikołaj Potocki. During the second day of the battle, the rebels were victorious, although the Tartars, too, were unpleasantly surprised by the determination and valor of the Polish army. In both battles, and having suffered rather painful losses of their own, they lost heart and fled. Tochai Bey and the Khan's brother-in-law, Mehmet Giray, were killed, some say even by Polish folk legend and military commander Jan Sobieski. Although there are many contradictory reports in regards to this, and Tochai Bey's actual place of death being hotly debated. But, as we all know, we all die, so can't argue that Tochai Bey is indeed deceased. So, from this more detailed report on the second day of the battle, it seems like quite a lot went down, more so than the first day. So the Poles felt great after the first day of charging valiantly with all their cavalry straight into the Cossack and Tartar positions. Oh yeah, we're the best. And from these accounts, it appears that the Cossack positions held easily due to their fortified position and their ample use of gunpowder. However, the Tartars suffered severe losses pursuing the Polish cavalry back to their camp, and ultimately they had to make use of the feigned retreat tactic and shooting circle maneuvers to pick apart the advancing Polish cavalry. This eventually causes them to rout once again due to the suddenly quick amount of losses. Now, why the Polish infantry and artillery remained parked in the camp, honestly, that's completely beyond me and most historians. But with the loss of many important officers, perhaps that could explain the breakdown of the chain of command and the incompetency that occurred as a result, especially if around 30,000 of the Polish infantry were levied men. Tactics and the art of war simply was just not something that they were trained in. They came straight off the farm into this battle. So regardless, this lack of reinforcement and covering fire ended up spelling almost near disaster for the Polish forces, and they were pushed all the way back into their camp, where they were forced to make a bloody stand. Now we can only imagine what this would be like, the amount of carnage, gunpowder, and choking smoke as the combat devolves around you into close quarter combat within an entrenched, undulating camp environment. But the Polish forces valiantly held firm, and just barely were able to push back the enraged and emboldened Tartars. Now, it's my personal speculation, based on the primary sources here, that Tochai Bey must have fallen somewhere in this part of the battle, which for me is why it accounts for why the Tartars and the Cossacks did not push this advantage once they made it all the way into the camp, and attempt to just crush the Polish camp entirely right here and now. They suddenly pulled back, and as the Polish commander says in his report, they lost heart, even though just barely being repelled by the heavy musket fire. So that's my personal guess on it. It's as good as anybody's, I'd like to think. Maybe worse. Okay, so this brings us to the third day of the Battle of Berestechko. Once again, from what is directly written, and I quote, "The Polish king insisted at a night council on engaging the enemy in a decisive battle the next day, Friday, the 30th of June. The Polish army appeared out of the morning mist in full strength, but only the Tartars engaged in skirmish, which was met by the Polish artillery. The Cossack defenses consisted of 2 fortified camps, a larger camp for the registered Cossacks and a smaller camp for the peasantry. Both were protected by around 10 lines of chained wagons, and at 3 p.m. Duke Jeromy Wisniewski led a successful charge of 18 cavalry companies against the right wing of the Cossack Tartar army, and this zealous cavalry attack was a success. It broke up the rows of Cossack infantry and the wagons moving in a corral formation. However, the Cossacks regrouped and pushed the Polish cavalry out of the camp and advanced further with the help of reinforcing Tartars. The left flank of the Polish army started to retreat when the king reinforced it with all his German mercenaries under command of Colonel Hudwalt, who repulsed the attack and drove the Tartars from the field. During the fighting, a Polish nobleman called Otwinowski noticed the Tartar Khan's standard, and Polish artillery was directed to fire at it. The Khan's brother, Amurat, was wounded mortally. With the battle already turning against them, the Tartar forces panicked, abandoning the Khan's camp as it stood and fled the battlefield, leaving most of their belongings behind. Klemensky and Hrushevsky, with a few Cossacks, chased the Crimean Khan, attempting to bring him with his force back, but were taken hostage by the Tartars instead, hoping to be released when the battle was over. A heavy rain started, which complicated cavalry operations. With the Tartar cavalry gone, the Cossacks moved their wagons in the night to a better defensive position closer to the Styr River. They dug trenches and constructed walls, to Polish surprise in the morning. Hot damn, what a day, guys! An epic, courageous charge by the Polish right into the right flank that ripped into the Cossack fortified wagon camp, and it started breaking their formation entirely. However, this is where we see the discipline of the Cossack infantry as they remain calm under such crazy circumstances, and they end up regrouping, reforming their defenses, and then, reload and re-engage the cavalry with fire and sword, as we say. Guns and melee weapons. And this ends up pushing the Poles back just in time for their Tartar allies to swoop into the fray and really get the Polish force, the cavalry, hightailing it the heck out of there before they become entirely encircled and slaughtered. So this is where we finally see a solid and importantly intelligent move by King John Casimir II when he says, "To hell with it, send in the big guns, boys!" And all of his heavy German mercenary fighters, the Landsknechts as they're called, or the Land Knights. And so you have to try and imagine what these guys would look like. They're half-plated, huge two-handed swordsmen. They also got muskets, and then you have artillery, charging forth and raining death upon the pursuing Cossack and Tartar forces. Meanwhile, the Polish cavalry is rushing towards them, being like, with hell hot on their heels, being like, "Save me, Papa!" And then all this chaos, death, explosions, gunfire, that's just next level. So you can imagine at this moment, truly the back and forth split second decision making that was made this day is the big difference between a victory and a defeat. And I have to say, good on King Casimir to learn from his previous day's mistake by actually reinforcing his valiant cavalry charge with mercenary shock infantry and artillery units rather than just keeping them in the camp. And this ultimately worked to devastating effect, because it utterly crushed the Tartar charge, and it utterly shattered their morale, because they were struck by a fortuitous artillery blast against the highest commanding officer, forcing the remaining Cossack and peasant forces to set up their defenses within the swamp. Damn, what a battle, guys. Holy! Alright, now to cover the less glamorous and realistic bloody drudgery that followed this Battle of Berestechko, which is the siege of the Cossack camps. Now, it really is just a prolonged continuation of these more glorious, high-profile pitched battles. But let's take a look, because it's important nonetheless. So, the siege of the Cossack camp. Right, so from what is directly written, and I quote once again, the Polish army and Cossack camp exchanged artillery fire for 10 days while both sides built fortifications. The Poles tried to blockade the camp. Leaderless without Klemensky, the Cossacks were commanded by Colonel Filon Dzezali, who was replaced later by Ivan Bohun on July the 9th. Other accounts state that the commander was Matvey Hladky. Now, Cossack morale was decreasing, and desertions started to take place on the other side of the river, though they maintained a high rate of artillery fire to cover their retreat, and still made occasional sorties into the Polish camp. When the Cossacks were offered terms for surrender, they were rejected, and the Poles prepared to dam the Pleshevka River as to flood the Cossack camp and try and get people out that way. Stanislav Lakronovsky, with a cavalry force of 2,000 men, moved across the river on July the 9th to complete the encirclement of the Cossack camp. Now, when they found out about this Polish advance, Ivan Bohun, the Cossack leader at the time, called for a council with the other leaders of the registered Cossack units as to what further actions could be done. However, he did not bother on talking with any of the peasant militia. So, you'll see how this plays in a second. So, the Cossacks built 3 bridges to get across the marsh, and Bohun led around 2,000 cavalry with 2 cannons on either side of the river to blast his way out of this encirclement. The uninformed peasants thought that they were abandoned, and they started to panic and flee across the river, just madly running across the swamps. Now, the Polish commander, whose name is just going to be the bane of my existence, Laskoronsky, didn't expect a large movement in his direction at all. And he ended up retreating, thinking that all these people madly coming across the swamp were attacking him. Now, as a result of all this, Bohun actually ended up returning to the camp and tried to restore order, but all was in vain, as the main Polish force was literally observing all of this chaos of people running all across the frickin' marshland, and they just sat on their hands. They didn't launch an attack on the Cossack camp because they thought that this was a trap. Why would all these people be seemingly running away, but then, coming back to the camp, and then it was just utter chaos. So, but this Polish force, after waiting and waiting, eventually decided to actually attack, and they breached the defenses, and they made their way to the river crossing that Bohun had made, the 3 bridges. Now, a few Cossack regiments managed to retreat in this chaos. Some Cossacks drowned, and there's a lot of archaeological excavations on the river crossing site that reveals about 100 to 200 Cossack human remains, all having damage due to cold weapons to their bones, which suggested heavy fighting. A rear guard of around 200 to 300 Cossacks protected this river crossing. All of them were completely slaughtered in the battle, rejecting surrender offers, and the Polish eventually took the bridges and slaughtered these men. Now, after this was done, Klemenski's tent was captured intact, which concluded all of his very expensive belongings. 2 banners, in particular, very important. One of them was received from King John Casimir II when he had to surrender in 1649 to the Hetman. So it was a way for the Polish to reclaim their honor after that big defeat. Now, although it was difficult to estimate how many Cossacks and peasants were killed in this retreat, Piasecki and Bryzotowski, who participated in the battle, mentioned that around 3,000 men were killed. The Tsar's ambassador from Russia, his name, Podatsky Bogdanov, in his report to Moscow mentioned around 4,000 people were killed. Now, most Cossack artillery pieces were either lost to the Poles or drowned in the marshes in this chaotic retreat. Many spoils were collected in the Cossack camp, including the army treasury that was somewhere close to about 3,000 gold pieces. There's a lot of money, guys. Now, me and myself, after this chaotic type of reports, I have to say I think it truly speaks well for itself on these events, even as roughly translated as they are. Sorry guys, I tried. I really did. And it's the best detailed report that we have, ultimately. And I can say, from having been to the site itself and seen the remains and the archaeological evidence, I can concur with the reports, honestly. I can only imagine the horror on all sides of such a trench-like warfare within a bog and marsh setting, and trying to escape by swimming under murky water using nothing but reed tubes that you hollowed out in order to breathe underwater, hoping you not get spotted. It's a truly hectic and sad loss of life. Musket fire, choking gunpowder smoke, hot, stinky, wet bogs, and a watery grave to be swallowed up by the muck and the mire. Damn, what a way to go. So, at the end of this, how does this all end? What was the aftermath from so much bloodshed? What did this do for anybody? War! What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. I'm waiting for the scrolls beat.
Gosh.
This is bonus features, folks.
Yeah, exactly. Karaoke time.
Yeah. Rebecca and I had the worst time filming this video.
Yeah,
It
you guys
was
are
so
lucky that it's
hard.
coming out.
Hope you like it. All right, so from what is directly written, and I quote, "The battle ended. King John Casimir II made the error of not pressing even harder the pursuit of the fleeing Cossacks. The first several days following the defeat of the enemy were so blatantly wasted, but there was the unwillingness of the nobility's levy en masse to proceed into Ukraine. Plus, rainy weather, a lack of food and fodder, coupled with epidemics and diseases, were becoming active in the army and were genuinely undercutting any energy of the army for war. The king left the whole army to Potocki to command on the 17th of July and returned to Warsaw to celebrate his victories over the Cossacks. After making promises of a pecuniary nature, Khmelnytsky was soon released by the Tartar Khan. He was then able to reassemble the Cossack host, which was able to present a substantial army to confront the Poles at the Battle of Berestechko in 1651. Poland and the bulk of the rebels make peace in this Treaty of Berestechko on the 28th of September 1651, which ultimately reduces the number of registered Cossacks from 40,000 to 20,000 and deprives them of the right to settle in or control various provinces of Ukraine previously allowed to them under the Treaty of Zboriev. The Ukrainian revolt, far from ending, would continue for several more years under Khmelnytsky. Through the course of this event, the Poles reportedly lost some 1,500 men, and the Cossack Tartar force lost some 20 to 30,000 men, depending on the reports. Now, with history being written by the victors, of course, the casualty rate of the Poles is miraculously less. However, given the sources I have presented just in this video, which, by the way, were mainly Polish for the vast majority of them, even the narrative of these Polish officers would point to there having to be at least a few more thousand casualties, given the description of the events that took place on the battlefield. Now, losses for the Poles and some 15 to 20,000 losses for the Cossack and Tartars, as the truth is always almost somewhere in the middle. Now, regardless though, the Polish force definitely did pull off a definitive and valiant victory from the jaws of defeat, and it capitalized on their own strengths and on the weaknesses of their enemies. The Cossacks, on the flip side, learned a valuable lesson through this experience of defeat, and their relations with the Tartars would never be the same after this event, and the Cossack leadership would change their entire battle strategy and their international relations as a result. For now, I'm going to leave it there, folks. It was an utter blast to share this huge battle with you all, and I sincerely hope you enjoyed it. And I look forward to providing more videos to you all. Now, in order to have the time and resources, be sure to please support me on Patreon and smash that like and subscribe button. Hit the bells of Kiev to alert of the incoming Mongol invasions. No. I mean to stay updated for new videos that are coming out. And until then, guys, Sili Chestva, strength and honor, Baka.